Hey, it's Tom from Tom's Toons, and in this video, I'm going to take you through installing this Deluxe helm. It's the new helm from PontoonStuff.com. All of the gauges, switches, and the compartment with our shift throttle. I'm going to take you through installation of all of this.
And that causes cavitation.
It definitely could. So I'm up on the boat, and I'm getting this all mocked up in place, and I'm actually going to run my screws down into the plywood, into the floor. What I like to do, positionally, it's just behind that bimini bracket, so I'll be able to run my pin through there. But I also left a little gap in the seat here. It's just a nice thing to have a little bit of space to drop a bag with towels or food, whatever you want. A little bit of space here and there is usually a good thing. With this, I've looked underneath, this is really important, and I found where the cross members are in relation to where the console is going to go. This is important because we're going to drill holes through the console, through the floor. We want to make sure that we're not going to hit a cross member, and we want to make sure it's convenient for us to run our steering cable and everything else up through. So I know that I have a cross member right about at this hole right here on the console. I was on the outside of the boat, Corey was up in here, and we lined it up. So when I get to actually drilling my holes, I'm going to look at that, and if I go just behind the cross member, I'm going to have an easier time routing my cables up and in, especially my steering cable. If I go just in front of the cross member, it's a little tighter bend, so if I'm going to go in front of the cross member, I'm going to go farther in front of the cross member, give myself some extra space. But first things first, I need to put my screws in to get this tied down, and I do usually personally add a couple bolts. In this case, I'll probably add 4 because it's a pretty big platform of 1/4 inch stainless steel bolts with a nut on the bottom just to lock everything in place. I'm going to square everything up. In this case, I know that my lines on my flooring are straight, so as long as I square my console up to that line in the teak flooring, double check everything position wise, I like it, I'm good to go here. So I'm going to run 4 stainless screws through the plastic, through the vinyl, into the plywood to hold everything in place here. And I can use the access door to do so. Hi there. Well, I'm about 5'7". I fit in here.
Looks like a good napping spot.
It actually, I think it would be very cozy to nap in. It's going to be very loud when I run this in. So again, when it comes to running my cables and stuff up through, I'm going to go look one more time and get exactly where my cross member is, because I think I have room to drill my holes on this side, the stern side of the cross member, which is going to allow me to use a little shorter cables, going to give me a softer bend coming up into the console. So I'm going to take a peek at that before it's always that measure twice, cut once kind of thing. Double check, triple check, quadruple check, then do it, because once you start putting holes through the deck, that's it. With my base of the console screwed into the deck, that's not going anywhere. I'm going to put in 2 3-inch rigging grommets. This is getting a lot of electrical, the steering cable. I want to have plenty of space to run my electrical up through. 2 grommets better than 1. You can pick up rigging grommets at PontoonStuff.com. A 3-inch option is on their website. But I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to cut through the plastic. Usually I got to pull the plastic out of my hole cutting bit, just a 3-inch hole saw, and then I'll go through the plywood. When you cut through the plastic first, you're going to get a disc. You're going to have to pull that off of your hole saw. So have a screwdriver up here. That might be a type of currency to some children, I don't know. It's not a wooden nickel, it's a plastic nickel. We're going to do that one more time so we have our 2 holes.
This is a wooden nickel.
That time we did plastic and all. All right. Cleanup crew.
Cleanup crew left some stuff.
Hey! Letters can't be chewed through.
Oh, man.
I'm going to go back in and get these rigging boots in. The nice thing about putting your rigging boots in or rigging grommets in now is that I can then just pass everything up through the console and I don't have to worry about forgetting to put the grommet on and having to unhook something, electrical or steering, just to get the grommet back on. So put your grommet on first, everything can go through it. It'll be peachy keen. Just get all the way in here.
Bye.
In case you wondered what type of space is in here, it's pretty adequate.
Ah, it's actually probably good.
Yeah, it's, she can't trap you in here forever, guys. Thank you, Pontoon Stuff, for putting the latch on the inside, too.
Frozen margarita if I make this. Okay, Tom? If I make that and that,
Yeah,
frozen margarita.
deal.
Money.
All you had to say was, it's Saturday, can I get a frozen margarita? And now I said, yeah. So if you peek in here from the side, you'll be able to see it pretty well. We've got those rigging grommets in. One will have the steering cable, probably some other electrical. The other will give me room to run my ignition, harness, and stuff for the motor in. And then let's not forget, we do still have this guy here. So this is where we're gonna mount our control box for this boat. It's getting a brand new 115 horse 4-stroke. That will get its own cutout. So I'm not gonna screw this in yet. I'm got my console where I want it. This can be fitted up just fine, but I gotta get my control box when I get the motor, and I'll take this down on the floor and cut out my control box. I can cut a cup holder in up here, drop that in, run a hose to drain it through. But just so you know, I'm not installing that into the floor yet. We'll get there. This is in place. Before I'm done, I'll put a couple through bolts in just for extra security. Let's go down to the table and get the console cut out, the top part of the helm, for our switch panel, gauge panel, and all that good stuff. When we look at the top of the helm, there are nuts in place that are going to allow us to thread in the posts in here. Those will correspond to holes in the console. So we'll be able to slide this in, tighten from the bottom, and get the top secured. But first, I just need to get everything cut out so that when I put it up on the helm, the bottom of the helm, connect them, everything's ready to run. So let's start with the switch panel. This is going to fit up on this part of the helm here. So it pretty much takes up that whole thing lengthwise. But what I need to do is I need to cut out to fit all my switches and breakers in. So if I make a 10.5 inch by 3 3/4 cutout, that will be big enough for all my switches to drop in. So I'm gonna go ahead and make a stencil for that. So just to mock this up, this is gonna clear my switches both ways, just barely. So when I put this on there, I'll cut my line, not way outside of it, but I'll just cut my line. So I'm gonna do with this, knowing that the switches are a little tighter to the inside of the helm. So I'm gonna go 3/4 of an inch over from the steering area. That gives me something to square up my stencil with.
Hey Tom,
What's up?
so for the sun shirt I did for you,
Yeah?
You're good.
You're just on YouTube now.
Yeah, you and your
You'll
sandwich.
be famous.
your logo's on the back,
Okay.
Pontoons logo on the back. Do you want anything on the sleeve?
I didn't know about these shirts.
He's like, I'm gonna make you shirts. And I said, you don't have to do that. And he said, no, it doesn't matter. I'm gonna do it.
That's pretty cool.
It's like the style of shirts that you like, that you always steal from his stuff.
Do you want anything on the sleeve?
Cavitation.
Cavitation.
Like, I don't know, like, do you have a little saying or
We do.
tagline? Or,
Well, anti-cavitation.
Yeah.
I'm serious. Here's the one tricky part. This is double walled. I ended up cutting into both walls on most of it. So I'll go back, make sure I cut the rest of it out, and then we can get to cutting out the gauge panel. And let's mock it up. So if you look close, you can see that I pretty much left just some of the line. That way I can always take more off. But if we size this up, we're almost there. I'm just barely hitting over on this USB port. Everything else dropped in nicely there, and we'll be able to form it and fit to the curve. So all I'm going to do is just notch out right on the side here, and then we'll be all set. And that's where that will fit in. Eventually we'll put the screws in, the stainless screws, to hold it in place. But before we even do that, let's just talk about what you see on the back here. For the switch panel, this is all your accessory stuff. Has nothing to do with your outboard or inboard or engine. This is just for your electrical accessories like navigation lights. It's already pre-wired into this. Your horn, your docking lights, bilge pump or live well pump, you've got all that, and then some extra places for accessories. This is going to plug right into that harness from PontoonStuff.com. That will plug right in. You run your harness up under the console. If you're using a different, maybe an aftermarket, or you made your own harness, you could use this to plug into your harness you made or are using, and then this would just plug right in to the switch panel, like so. We're going to be using the harness, so we'll get rid of that. Ooh, if I make this, you get 2 margaritas. The can on the left. Too strong.
But you made one. You made the one in the back.
It's back there. You get 1.5 margaritas.
Sold.
If we look at this panel, we've got our colored wires. We've got lots of videos out there on the harness and what these colored wires mean. They all come in and they tie in. We have a big power and a big ground wire that come in and supply power to our breakers and ground all of our accessories. That's basically all you need to know, but if we look close, we have our powers coming in to our breakers. So when we look at the front of our switch panel, we have a switch and a breaker, resettable breaker right next to it. When we flip this over, this is that horn switch that we were just looking at right here, right here. This is the breaker that is associated with it. If we look at where our power comes in, the harness is actually coming in to this breaker and switch just to start things. But on every breaker and switch combo, we have power coming in, main power coming in. These are the same essentially. And then we have power from the breaker jumping across to the switch. So if we're looking at this one with the orange and white wire, that's my horn. This wire comes into the switch. And then when you turn the switch on, it kicks power out to this wire. There's a post underneath here. That's your positive out or your power out post. So when I push the horn button, that's taking power from this wire, essentially from the breaker and from the battery, and putting it out to my horn. When we look at our switches, aside from our navigation lights, a little more complicated looking one here because we have a switch that goes in 2 directions for our navigation lights and just our anchor light. But when we look at the rest of the switches, let's jump down here for instance. We're going to have a ground wire on the top. That black wire grounds to the battery. We have that power wire coming across from the breaker. And in this case, we have an open post right here. So that means that this switch right here, I could literally use for any accessory as long as I supply that accessory with a ground. What you can do for that, you could just use a piggyback splice. I'll show you that right now. And I would stack a ground wire from my accessory onto this post by unplugging this terminal, putting my piggyback post with my ground for my accessory on the post, attaching the ground from the switch panel, and then I can hook my power wire up. So if I'm running an LED, underseat LED, I can put my positive wire from my underseat LEDs here, and I can piggyback my ground here. The other option would be to run a bus bar, a negative bus bar or ground bus bar, to attach all of my grounds to. And then at that point, I would just need to tie somewhere into this ground wire or from the battery. That's how these switch panels work. That's how you can modify them to make them work better for you. Otherwise, most of this stuff is already pre-wired in terms of This switch here is my docking lights. This switch is wired to be an accessory, which I can tie in accessories to these two accessory wires. My orange is my power, black is ground. I have two of those. Another switch is going to be pre-wired for my live well or bilge pump. That's this switch here. So as long as you understand that each accessory that you're going to use needs a ground and a positive, you can rearrange. You could unplug. This is the live well wire. I can unplug that and I can put whatever accessory I want on here. Personally, I like to have my navigation lights and then the switch right next to it, my docking lights. So I'm going to unplug this gray with a black stripe and I'm going to plug that in to where that orange with or brown with an orange stripe was. So what I did is now I made the switch next to my navigation lights, which is this switch, my docking lights. Now I can jump this to wherever I want, or I can just omit it and add my own accessories. I do recommend if you're going to add accessories to this, I would run an extension wire off of this, make it easy to get at, or don't install this yet and you'll be able to pull wires through, hook them to the switches you want, and then install this back in once we're up on the boat. Our other panel that's included in this kit is going to go on this side. So it's just an accent panel, but in this case, we're going to use this for the stereo. So I'm not going to do anything right now with this. I'm going to end up just installing it when I get to that point of installing my stereo and then cutting my hole for everything. For fit up purposes, I'm going to go ahead and just mock this up where it's going to go. And I'm just going to put a couple screws in. We make sure we're fit up nice, level across the top. This will make it easier when I get up on the boat. Just putting those two in right now because what I want to do is make sure that this panel shares the same spacing here on the outside and on the top, as close as I can get to it, right about there. And we're just going to put in our screws. Make sure we're nice and level. That's where those panels are going to go. And I'm going to install a stereo on this left side. I would guess that it's no coincidence that the Deckmate stereo fits wonderfully right in the center of that. And our old trick for cutting out the Deckmate stereo is using that housing that it comes into the package and tracing this smaller circle, and that's what's going to allow that to slide in place. So with that centered, I'm just going to trace inside here. Did I miss?
No, you're good.
I drew on my face. Now I can cut that out. I just use my Dremel tool on this as well. And don't forget that this is double layered as well behind our panel here. So that's going to come out nice and clean. Those are kind of melted together. And then I just got to make sure that I punch out this second layer. And you could put this on and I could cut a bigger opening in this and install the stereo just into this plastic. But I like having the extra plastic behind it just to reinforce. I definitely like at least having one of these layers. If I cut the inside layer back, I could, but I think this is going to work really well. And don't forget, you do have a peel plastic that you can peel once you're done with all your cutting. Protective plastic to peel off on this extra panel. So that will get installed there. We'll install the stereo into it. Fits in there. And right in. So our stereo will sit there nice and centered. I think that's going to look really good. And the last thing we got to cut out is going to be our gauge panel. I like leaving a little extra for reinforce, having something that's a little more reinforced. So what I'm going to do is basically just measure in a few inches. I'm going to leave a little bit here, and then I'm going to end up cutting pretty much everything else out. But I'm just going to leave a little extra, we'll say 4 inches on this side. to make that panel fit, I'm gonna cut just inside. I'm gonna leave about 1/4 to 1/2 inch inside of this line here. And then on this right-hand side, I'm gonna leave about 4 inches. Just leave a little extra material, it's not gonna hurt, because the right side of this panel has a lot of space. We do need to add a fuel gauge as well, but following in suit of these gauges, we're gonna put our fuel gauge right in the middle, so that'll already be cut out and I can add it to my panel. And then keep in mind, you're gonna have that double layer again. We're gonna have to cut out a little bit of that too. Give that a good little shake out off the boat, because it's gonna be a mess if you do it on the boat. And then let's look at this real quick, just to talk through our gauges. Not gonna go into great depth, but we have a depth gauge that comes with the whole kit with a transducer. Easy to install, because all you need to do is plug in your transducer cable here, and that's it. It's already supplied power, it's got its own fuse, it's ready to go. Then you have a tachometer. On your tachometer, you have a pulse or pole setting. You're gonna need to look at the chart that comes with it and find your outboard and see which 3P, 4P, 5P, 6P. This motor is a brand new 4-stroke Mercury, 115 horse. It's gonna be a 6 pulse, 12 pole setting, 6 pulse, and that's what my instructions tell me to do. So I'll turn this dial. It's already actually aimed right at the 6P. I use a flathead screwdriver for that. As we move over, we have a GPS speedometer. And the way that that works, there's a reading, a GPS puck. This can be installed under the console. It's got a 3M sticky. You could put it outside, but I've been told by the manufacturer that this will read under the console just fine. You've also got a volt gauge here. That's just gonna tell us our voltage of our battery. Should be reading around 12, 12.4, maybe a little higher when you're running your outboard, that's typical. And then we have a pigtail wire coming off. We've got a black, which is a ground wire. We've got a purple, which is gonna be a power wire, or this would tie into your key on power so that your gauges power up when you turn the key to the on position. And this gray wire is your tach sending wire. We've got videos that go into detail on how these tie in to your outboard harness. I will splice these right into my gauge harness for my Mercury. It's pretty much plug and play, and I am gonna add a fuel gauge, so I will have to cut one more hole in here. A 2-inch hole will match the size of these. If you wanna match these gauges, you can look up Sierra brand, and it's the Lido, L-I-D-O. It will match this perfectly. I have a fuel gauge that matches right up. It's gonna go right in the middle. So I'll center it on my other two 2-inch holes and put it in. The way that I'll power my fuel gauge is I can just tie in. We have post here with the purple wire. This is an ignition. It says IGN power post. I can use that to power my fuel gauge for the ignition post of my fuel gauge. I've got ground wire here. I can use that to ground my fuel gauge. And then I will have a light, which I can tie in here. This is my backlight for my gauges. I can supply that to the light post on my fuel gauge. The light post on my fuel gauge will look like this. It's a male spade terminal underneath. And then I'll run my sending wire from my fuel tank and my ground wire from my fuel tank to the fuel gauge. Let's see how this fits up. So we've got that gauge cluster. We'll square it up on that dash, put our screws in, but it's gonna be a little bit before we get to that step. But now that I know everything's fit up here, I like where we're at. The one last thing I'm gonna do before I take it up on the boat is I'm gonna cut my steering mechanism out right here. I've got a stencil for that, but you could use your brass fitting that goes into your helm for your steering. You could use that and trace that as well. Don't lose all those nice little stainless screws. You're gonna need those. If you did lose them, they're just a number 8 stainless 3/4 inch screw. We are ready actually to go ahead and put this up on the helm on the top side. So let's do that. Give that top a few more shakes before you take it up on the boat. A lot of plastic in there. Goodness, it never ends. You are gonna need a 7/16 socket or end wrench for tightening your hardware. Before we set this up, we need to put our threaded posts in. Those are gonna come in that hardware bag. I'm gonna give them a few turns in on each post. There are 8 in total, and sometimes these are stubborn. You gotta give them a little shake while you turn. Gonna shake it and turn at the same time to get it going. With those in place, I can set my helm on by lining up my holes carefully. Now I'm going to go underneath, and you're supplied with 8 locking nuts as well, all stainless steel here. And I'm going to use that 7/16 wrench or socket to tighten everything in. That's going to close the gap between here and seal that off nicely. You could run a bead of silicone, clear silicone, along your edges on the top and sides. Wouldn't hurt. So the ticket, when you're getting underneath there, is to run an extension. It's about a 6-inch extension on a deep well, 7/16 socket. That was money. Went around, tightened everything, and then just gave everything one more little snug up. Don't crank over tighten. You don't want to pull any of those nuts that are inside and the plastic out. But that sealed up really well, pulled everything into place. Again, if this gets direct water driving at it, if you don't have a cover on your console, water could get underneath here. It might be something you could put a piece of weather stripping around the perimeter before you put it on, or run a bead of silicone afterwards. In this case, any water that gets in there is going to drain through where my rigging boots are. It'll find its way out over time. But we don't want moisture underneath the helm if we can help it, because that's where all of our electrical is running. So do your best to seal it up, tighten everything, and you'll be in good shape.
Are we done here?
Wait, double or nothing?
Double or nothing.
Triple margarita.
Hold on. Let me get in a better spot.
It's a Frisbee style. Happy lady.
Spending all your money on margaritas.
Happy wife, happy life. If you look at the gauges here, you can see that everything's covered up. So another way to do this would just be to run a hole saw. Make a quick cut through. Now I've got easier access to run that harness down through or up through to put the gauge panel in. I gotta go get her some margaritas. We'll finish this on Monday.
I mean, I think one will be more than enough. But I'm gonna bank those other 2 margaritas.
I've installed my steering mechanism here, and then one thing you gotta look out for, so I had to widen this. I'm gonna have to shift things over slightly. I've got room to do it on for my stereo, but you can see this guy right here. That's that part of the helm, the rotary helm. That would have been in the way of my stereo just by 1/4 of an inch. So I was able to cut this a little wider. We'll just shift things over ever so slightly. There's a little room for play there, so I'm not worried about it. But something to keep in mind, if I do this again, I will install the stereo over offset left to clear that rotary helm. It's a really common type of steering mechanism. And then this can just be moved out of the way when we get our switch panels in there. But this is the end, that the part of the rotary helm, so that just pushes up out of the way. That's where the cable is inside of that when we're steering at different points of the steering. I'm back down off the boat, and I've got the control box, little station, helm station here. And what I'm gonna do is fit up my controls to fit in here. I've got Mercury brand. This is the control box that we're installing. It's a brand new Mercury binnacle mount. So typically you're gonna see binnacle mount or topside mount. That's the type of control box that's gonna sit down inside and have your shift and throttle up on top. They do supply in these manuals, the back page is a template here, but what I do, and this will work if you have your old controls, you're just reusing them, you've got this bezel here. So my control box, the thumb side is gonna be where this round part is right here. So I can size this up and fit it on, And then I'm just gonna trace the inside of this, and then I can mark my holes as well so that I can drill out my holes, usually 3/16 of an inch. If you are not using through bolts, sometimes it will be a really heavy stainless screw. You could use that too, but I do prefer to through bolt it. In the new kit, it actually comes with a unique little through bolt with a rubber, I don't know if you want to call it a bushing or what, but it helps suck everything tight and hold that nut. It's a locking mechanism. When I size this up, I like to cheat this over to the outside. So this is going to be facing the driver. This will be along the railings. And I'm just going to slide this over and up towards the front and position it there. And what that does is it just gives me a little more room on the inside, because we do have this little storage compartment here, and the guts of the control box, they're rather long on these new Mercuries. They're going to sit down there pretty far. I just want to make sure I have plenty of clearance, but also cheating it over an inch rather than going close to the captain's seat. It's going to give me more room for the captain's seat, which tends to be helpful when you're pivoting, swiveling around in the captain's chair. So I square everything up, and I'm going to trace on the inside of this. I'll cut on my line with my Dremel tool, and then I'm going to go ahead and mark where my holes are going to be drilled for my hardware to go through. Again, this is the piece that I would use if I were reusing an old control box, which is really common. Even Yamaha, Suzuki, everybody typically has a bezel like this that you could go ahead and just mock up and use as your stencil. So I've got that drawn on. I'm going to use my Dremel, cut on the line, and then drill out my 3/16 holes. And then this is going to be ready to go up. We'll remove this cover. I'll show you that. And then we'll screw this into the floor, cut my through hole, and we'll be in a really good spot to start installing my controls and getting everything coming together for this console. That is ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and just pull this panel. I just need to pull the outer screws out. We're going to get that out. That way I can take it up on the boat and get some screws in to hold this in place. That comes right out. We'll just set that aside for now. And let's take this up on the boat and get our screws in, holding this in place. We're just going to use big, heavy number 10 or 12, 1 inch to lock it in place up against the console. With that box back up in place, push it forward nice and snug, get it mocked up along the railing where I want it. And I'm just going to take, again, a big, heavy duty, it's a Phillips, this is a number 12, I believe, big heavy guy. We're going to go in each corner, so 4 total screws, lock that down. I am going to install, when I run my controls through, a rigging boot, rigging grommet. That'll go through the floor, so we're going to get an additional 6 screws just locking the middle in place. This thing will be really secure by the time we're done. That's in. It's already really nice and solid. The other thing that I am going to do in this case, when we're using these 2 consoles, I'm going to punch a hole. Just going to do a 2-inch hole with a hole saw, and I'm going to go ahead and run that through this control box piece into the console. That's going to allow me to run my neutral safety wire and my trim harness. That there's just a quick plug, 3 wires that plug in from the control box to the ignition harness. The rest of the ignition harness is going to live underneath the bottom of the console, because that's got to feed my gauges, that's got to feed my ignition and that sort of thing too. So I am going to connect these. I just did an installation of this with the smaller helm, the standard helm, and in that case I ran everything up under the floor, and I did have room, but with this setup it just makes sense. It's going to be a lot simpler, and if you ever had to change things out, it's going to offer easier access there too. And then I have one more hole to cut through, but before I do that, I'm going to go on the outside of the boat, make sure I have it positioned cross member wise. I got to make sure that I don't have a cross member in the way. But what I need to do essentially is straight down from my binnacle mount here, my shift throttle cables need to go through the floor And that too can just be a 2-inch hole. We can do a 2-inch rigging grommet, or you can give it a little more space, a little more room for play, do a 3-inch rigging grommet. Your control cables, shift and throttle, don't like to have a lot of tension right near the control box. So you can put an 8 to 12 inch radius bend in them, but coming right out of the control box, you'll see they don't like to be bound up, zip tied, anything like that. It just makes things harder to shift and throttle friction wise, and will wear your cables out faster. So I'm going to use the bigger grommet. That gives me a little more play for my cables to move freely. What's nice about having the fence risers under your railing is you can peek under and see where the control box is, where seat bases are. Maybe you're installing speakers and speaker wire and you want to make your hole or your run down through in front of or behind a particular cross member. In this case, I could see that the cross member is right about 6 to 6.5 inches in front of the back of my compartment here. So that puts me here. That means I need to come way far forward anyway. I'm gonna have plenty of clearance where I'm not hitting a cross member. Let's go ahead and put that hole in. We'll get that vacuumed out, and then I can install, I'm gonna use number 10 1-inch stainless screws to hold my grommet in place. I install this first, just like on the console, so that as soon as I'm ready to pass my cables up through, they go through the grommet, and then I can come up through the hole, not have to worry about forgetting about the grommet, having to unhook everything. That's the worst. The other thing is, make sure when you run your cables up to install them, they've gone through the grommet and through that black bezel piece to your control box. I've done it before. I don't do it anymore. I finally learned my lesson, but you're going to want to make sure that you run them through that bezel. I have installed them completely and then goofed up and had to take it all back apart so that I could put the bezel in place. We've got the control box in, run down through the floor. So there's that grommet. Everything runs down through. My trim is here, hooked up, and neutral safety wires are hooked up. So I'm ready to throw the panel back on, and this is done here. Up here, I installed just using some marine plastic. I put my key switch and safety kill lanyard on there, and that's all wired in behind. So this will pull down behind and tie up. Steering is ready, stereo's in. So now all I'm gonna do is get my switch panel set up with my accessory wires ready to plug and play, and I can install that when I'm to that point. And then the gauges, I ended up just punching a hole right through here so I can drop that gauge wire, gauge harness down and tie into my gauge harness from the factory from Mercury. You have a switched power, key on power. We've got some other gauge wires, water temp, trim indicator, but I'm going to use my ground wire, that black wire, and then there's a gray, the tack. We're going to use that too. So we're just going to use these 3 wires to connect to our gauge panel. These will just, I usually put electric tape on top, cap them off, and then tie them back. So I'll be able to just splice these. I'll have to get rid of the ring terminals and just do a butt splice. Then I'll splice them right into the gauge panel when I'm ready to install that, which is coming up pretty quick here. That's back in. I'm gonna go ahead and get my captain's chair in so I can sit while I'm working on the switch panel and running wire and installing everything on the dash. We are now looking at the switch panel, and I do my best to try to keep this stuff as simple as possible because I know how intimidating this all looks. I'm gonna break down what I did and how I get this ready to just go run right up on the boat and plug and play. I have my main plug-in here that will hook to my accessory harness from PontoonStuff.com. I have a orange with a white stripe and a black ground pigtail that's coming off here. I'm just gonna tie that right up to that pigtail that plugs into my main harness. I'm just gonna tie it up. I'm not gonna do anything with it because my horn is right up underneath the bow of the boat, where in the harness there's another wire that corresponds to this same thing, orange with a white stripe. And if we were to actually look at the horn switch, which is right here, that wire comes up and right here. See this guy right here? That power goes 2 down into 1. So one of those is running out to this little pigtail here, and the other continues out and gets activated, we'll use that term, by the plug here out on the harness. So no matter what, when I push the horn switch, both of those are getting 12 volts. It's a pretty significant draw to power that up. I've never tried running 2 horns. I just run one either under the console, usually on smaller boats like 16 footers, or out under the front deck, or maybe under a front seat. We move along here. We have our navigation lights on this. I didn't touch anything with that. That just runs that gray with a blue. That'll go to my stern light, gray with a green. That will go to power my front or my bow navigation lights. The next switch is my gray with a black stripe. That's going to be my docking lights. So the way that we look at this, horn, nav, docking. We're going to move down to this switch now. And what we have here is my live well wire, that brown with an orange stripe. I unhooked it from where it was and I just plugged it in. It's already got a ground associated here, so we're good that way. But I plugged it in on this switch, so it goes horn, nav, docking, and then the next lights are going to be my stern undersea LEDs. What I did, because this orange stripe, brown with an orange stripe, is included in the accessory harness from PontoonStuff.com, it's towards the stern. It's usually used for a bilge pump or a live well pump out on the back of the boat. I'm not using it for any of that. So I went ahead and I spliced in my 2 LEDs in the back of the boat into the power, which is the brown with an orange, and there is a corresponding ground. I spliced them right in. So this switch with this brown and orange wire going out will power up my rear LEDs. The next one over is one that comes already pre-wired with a ground and a positive. If we chase this orange wire out, it continues around and down here, and it has a corresponding ground. So I went ahead and labeled that rear LED. Oh, I goofed up. I labeled that rear LED. It's actually the front LED, so no worries there. I'll make that change. Fixed it. If you guys think that I'd go through all these projects with no hiccups and no issues, I goof up all the time. So that's my front LEDs. So that next switch over is going to power up my front undersea LEDs. And then I have another one of those. There's 2. We have an orange power wire that goes out, and if we follow that one around, comes around here, and this one has a corresponding ground as well. That's going to power my stereo. Simple stereo, Bluetooth with 4 speakers. So that will hook power up to my stereo. We'd come over to the next switch. I'm going to leave this bare. So I could tie off an extra accessory. I probably will just run 16 gauge with a couple butt splices out. I can piggyback a ground here. I've got my wire connector kit. You can get those at tomstoons.com. We sell all the connectors you'll need. I'm using this on this boat, and we're getting through a lot of them. It's 100+ pieces, but the goal is we're going to give you what you need and not a ton of what you don't need. I can run an extra accessory wire off just so that the user, the boat owner, could plug something in there if they want to in the future. Make it easy to run wires up without having to completely unhook the switch panel. I can just label it extra accessory, and that'll give them the option there. So here's where I changed things up quite a bit. This switch was bare as well. So these 2 could have been tied in however you want. But what we have are 2 USB chargers up here. And I like these new ones. They have a power switch or power button on them, but it's really easy to forget this little button here will power it up. It's really easy to just cap that off and forget that that little button is still on, and then these backlight LEDs stay on, and eventually will drain your battery. No, not right away, not right this second, but if you're gone for a couple weeks, you come back to your boat, you might be drained down if you don't have a battery switch. So what I do is on this last switch that's right underneath the USB chargers, I go ahead and I ran power from the switch. So what this looked like before, power jumped across to the breaker, and then the breaker supplies power to the wire that actually comes across and supplies power to the switch. And then this empty post, just like this one here, when the switch turns on, power comes out of that. So this used to jump across to here and then up to my charger, so that the chargers always had power running to them. This is my main power wire coming in from the battery. What I did is I took my wire that used to jump from this breaker up to this breaker, and I went ahead and I cut it and I spliced it into another wire that was doing the same thing, because it used to go over, over, over. Well, now I just took it from here to over here to power those top switches. Totally fine to do. And the way that I'm going to power my USBs now is by supplying the power out from this last switch up to the top of the breaker where this big heavy wire used to be, and then jumping across. Again, these connectors are out of our kit too, jumping across to the top of the other breaker for that USB charger. So those two breakers that I powered are right here and right here. So those have power, which then supply power straight to the USB. I just made it so that this switch has to be on in order for these breakers to have power to supply power to the USB. I always try to keep it as simple as possible. Worst case, go back and watch this segment a few times with your switch panel in your hand. Pause it when you need to. Take a look. This might not be exactly how you set yours up, but this is how I've got it set up, because I like it to go lights in a row, then accessories, and then I always put my USBs on their own switch. So I'm gonna go ahead and just splice in a power here, and I'll piggyback this ground, and I'll just do a 2-strand, and I'll put butt splices on the end of that so that this has the option to supply power to an accessory. And there we go. Some marine grade. This is my positive and ground coming off. And what I did is a female spade terminal here. Yes, I used the pink terminal. It works just fine with most 16 gauge wire. So I'm going to run the smallest possible terminal or butt splice as I can, as long as all that wire will fit in there okay. And then I took that black wire in the strand and I spliced on a piggyback terminal. And what that looks like is something like this. This happens to be a 10 gauge, so it's a bigger one. But what this allows me to do is plug the female spade part here onto the negative post, and then I can run the other ground that was already there. This big guy looks just like this. I could run that right on top of this piggyback post, the male post, and I just wrap them both in electrical tape, and that way everything's tied together and won't pull loose. So this could be tied into basically any other 12-volt accessory, as long as 16 gauge wire is sufficient. They're all 10 amp breakers, so 16 gauge should be plenty to supply flow of power out to those accessories. I'll tie this in here, this little bundle, make it nice and clean, and this is ready to go up on the boat and plug stuff in. Let's look at what all I have here. This is the switch panel. So this, I bundled everything up just a little tighter, make it a little tidier. I have my front LEDs, and from underneath I have my front LED. I labeled that so I can splice these together to start things off. And yes, I did cut off the stock connectors that came with this, and I put on heat shrink butt splice. It's just that one extra step, and because this is a customer's boat, I want to do everything in my power to keep it from coming back with any issues in the future. I'm going to double check and make sure I routed this wire where I want to underneath to keep things clean. Looks good. Let's go ahead and splice it in. And remember, my rear LED is already wired in to the accessory harness from PontoonStuff.com. I used that bilge wire. Actually, I think it says bilge pump on the wire on the harness, but I used that brown with an orange stripe as my tie-in for those rear LEDs. So my LEDs are good to go. This was that extra 10 amp accessory. I just labeled red positive, black negative, so I don't need to worry about that right now. That horn wire, not going to worry about that. My stereo. So I have all of my speaker wires and that quick plug. We're using the Bluetooth stereo from Deckmate. I've got that all right here. So what I can do is splice in my power and ground to the stereo power and ground. Now my stereo plug is ready to plug into the back of the stereo, and I'm ready to plug my switch panel into my accessory harness. I'm going to feed all my wires back down, keep them in order there. I've got some wires coming from my safety lanyard. I'm going to tie those up before I tuck this back down in there. I am going to have to just, with my Dremel tool, I'm going to have to cut this out just a little bit in here to give room for those last couple switches. They're just barely hitting. So we'll cut that out real quick here. Something you could do beforehand, and when you line this up, you can see this interferes just a little bit. But we can cut that out and then get this installed. So I cut that out there, and then one other noteworthy item is this black plastic piece here is coming off of my steering mechanism, my rotary helm. That's actually a coiled cable that's going to slide through there when the cable's fully pulled this way. It mostly slides out when it's pushed back to turn the motor the opposite way. I drilled a hole in the plastic right here and did a couple zip ties just to tie that kind of just gently bent back out of the way, and that'll prevent that from moving around, interfering with the backs of my switches, because this side of the panel, you know, they were just lightly bumping it and it would have been fine, but I went ahead and just fit it up to where now it sits in there and it's not touching that steering mechanism, and that thing can move a little bit from time to time. I just want to prevent that from happening or making wires come undone. I'm going to run these screws in all the way around and let's test this thing out. I didn't go into a huge breakdown on the gauge hookup. It's very straightforward. I dropped my wires down through the hole, put my screws in their respective holes, and then went underneath and spliced in for my power, key on power, tack, sending wire, and ground. And as you can see, I've got my fuel gauge that's going to hook up as soon as I run my fuel system in. So I'll splice in my sending wire here to the red and my ground to the black. The nice thing about already having squared this right up is I can just run these top two screws in that I had already run, and then run the rest, and that way I know it's already squared because I did it down off the boat. I'm just tightening them snug. I don't crank them in. You won't hear my impact do its thing. As soon as I see that carbon fiber kind of flex a little bit, that's good. And be extra careful, because the last thing you want to do is be pushing real hard with your screwdriver, your impact, your drill, and then have it slip off and gouge your carbon fiber. I say it because I've done it before. It's not fun. Alrighty, let's take a look at everything. I've hooked power up at the battery. Always hook everything else up before you've hooked the power up. Horn, that's up on the front underneath. We've got navigation lights, so your switch is going to light up. If you can see in the reflection of that boat over there, that's that running light, and then there's red on that side. And if I flip this back, it's going to power only my anchor light. So if I'm pushed forward, that's all three lights, my port, starboard, bow lights, and my anchor light up on my bimini. If I push this back, it's just my anchor light and my bimini. When I run my bimini wire, I just chase it right up out of this compartment, straight up with some wire clips and conduit, and then we tie it into a quick connect. Moving to the next switch, we've got our docking lights. You see those bright LEDs, super bright, especially when they're mounted in the railings, and then the wires chase down through the seats and floor. We've got our rear LEDs under seat. The next switch is our front LEDs. And then this is our stereo. I've already turned my stereo on. The cool thing about this stereo is if I want it, I can just turn my switch on and off, and that will turn my stereo on and off automatically. Or I can manually turn it off. And the power, the switch, just gonna make sure there's no power going out. I can turn my switch back on. Nothing happens until I push the power button. Whatever works better for you is a route you can take. I like it to just have the switch in the off position with that stereo turned on, and then when I power my switch back on, my stereo will always kick back on for me. Just makes it easy. That way I know what switch is doing what too. I don't have to guess. This was that extra switch, so we're gonna leave that so we can tie it in. And then this is our USB chargers. So on this, I do still have to push this little power button on, but it's really easy. If the boat got left and that was covered, no one realized that that light was still on. It could drain you down slowly over time. I don't know how long it would take, but it would kill your battery eventually. So this way, no matter what, if the switch is off, those USB chargers are off. So when I leave the boat, after a long day on the water, I'm tired, had too many margaritas, whatever you drink, whatever you do on your boat, that's up to you. But as long as all my lights are off on my dash, I have no power going out. I've killed the connection between the breaker and the switch and the accessory. Nothing's happening there. And the last piece of this whole puzzle, when I turn my key to on, you're gonna hear that beep from the alarm system of my motor beep first. That's that louder beep. And then I've got my depth gauge beeping just to let us know that that alarm is working. And we can turn an alarm on for different depths to alert us when that's happening, when we're in too shallow of water. So if you know your boat can make it through 3 feet of water, no problem, you could set it for 3 feet. That way, if you get any shallower, it's gonna let you know. But there's a whole owner's manual associated with this gauge. Peel that right off now that we're ready. And the other gauges, we've got our tachometer, we've got our fuel gauge. I haven't even hooked that up yet, so that's obviously not reading correctly. And then we've got our GPS speedometer and our volt gauge there as well. So everything powers up, backlights are on. The only thing left to do is run this motor when everything's hooked up and ready to go for it. And that's with everything put together. This customer opted to keep, they had some nostalgia, this Destroyer style steering wheel. They asked to keep that. It's been in the family, I think, for a long time, so they really like that wheel. But there is a carbon fiber wheel that matches, a little sportier option too. But this looks really good. Everything's ready to go on it. We're just gonna get to finishing this boat up and then getting this on the water this spring.